Okay, so we're starting up with part two on our module two lecture video, continuing with the Larkin reading, The Peacemaker and the Great Law of Peace. This visual is very important, and there are some key elements that you should be familiar with. So here is the visual, and then below are the key symbols that you need to know. So I will toggle back and forth between each one. So to start, there's the white pine tree or tree of peace. This tree is the white pine tree, and it symbolizes the great law of peace itself, the peace that all five of the tribes created when they came together. It's also said to represent the shelter of peace, so that as long as the tribes shelter under the branches of the tree, they would be protected by the great law of peace. Next symbol, the eagle. So we have the eagle here at the top of the tree, also known as the eagle that sees far. And that is a hint as to why it's important. Eagles are known to be able to see up to a mile away. So the idea is that with the eagle at the top of the tree, it will be able to see and give warning of any threats that are coming that could threaten the peace. Next symbol, the four roots. So you'll notice the tree has four roots, 1, 2, 3, 4, that stretch out in all four directions, representing north, south, east, and west, with the idea that the roots of peace spread in all directions. Next is the turtle. So in Native American symbology, and also symbology of many other races and ethnicities, there are different meanings that are attributed to different animals. So in Native American symbology, one of the meanings of the turtle is endurance and stability. And the idea here is that the turtle holds up the world. Basically, the turtle holds up or provides the foundation for the peace. Everything is built upon it, everything rests on it. Next, you have the bundle of 5 arrows, as you see here. So this is a representation of part of the story wherein the 5 tribes, when they came together and decided to all live under the great law of peace, they buried their weapons under the tree, under the shelter of the tree of peace. So this is a separate picture, but I wanted you just to see that we do have representations of the great law kind of present in our society. And so these 5 arrows that are bound together are meant to be, or said to be, planted under the great law, under the tree, so that the tribes would not go to war against one another anymore. Next is, have the eagle twice, so you only need to know it once. Next you have the wolf and then the bear. So the wolf here represents a very interesting idea of instinct tied to intelligence. And the wolf is thought to be, or a representation of both. Not only does the wolf have sharp and strong instincts, it is also very intelligent and able to kind of use its mind. So the idea of the wolf watching over the tree of peace is meant to kind of represent the balance of instinct and intelligence. And then here on the opposite side, you have the bear, which represents strength and also represents sovereignty. So the idea is that all of the nations coming together under the great law would do so in order to protect all of their strength, but also in order to protect their sovereignty or their ability to kind of govern themselves. So these are some key symbols that you should be familiar with in your understanding of the great law. So I mentioned that many of those symbols, many of those elements are present in our society today. And it's important to note that the early American politicians that we know of as the founders of this country, including George Washington, Ben Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, they met frequently with the Iroquois delegates. And these delegates were known as members of the Iroquois Confederacy. And members of the Confederacy actually attended the Continental Congress in 1776, where they were writing that first draft of the Constitution. So it is not an idle statement to say that the United States Constitution was influenced by and informed by the Great Law of Peace, because it had already been in place, as I said, over almost 400 years before the founders attempted to create the United States Constitution. And as we'll talk about in a second, there were some key principles that were embedded in the Great Law that were also borrowed for the American Constitution and symbols to represent America as well. So this painting, this drawing, just depicts kind of a mixture of members of the Iroquois Confederacy. So you see someone here, you see some folks here, representatives of the Iroquois, and you see them all in the same room with some of the founders of the country. So important to keep that in mind. So to understand the Great Law of Peace, there are also some core principles that are outlined in the Larkin reading, and you should be familiar with all of these. Larkin outlines them very well, very clearly, so I'm not going to read them all to you, but just know that these are considered 4 very important Great Law of Peace principles, and that you should know them so that you understand how the Great Law of Peace functions. And then finally, in terms of the Great Law, you need to understand the American symbols that were adopted from the Great Law of Peace. So these are some visuals that I'm sure you have seen before. They probably look familiar to you. And so if you look back at the earlier visual, or if you understand the story that I was just telling you about how the Great Law was formed and what some of the key principles are, you can see some of these visuals are represented here. So, for example, the Tree of Peace was in the earlier visual I showed you. This picture is from the back of a dollar bill, and you can see that rather than an entire tree, we do have these olive branches here. And in this is a copy of the presidential seal of the United States, and you see again the olive branch. So what was the Tree of Peace became the Liberty Tree, and then the olive branch, just one branch of the tree, was taken from that, and it was meant to indicate that we have a strong desire for peace, but we are ready for war. So the symbol was reduced a bit, but it is still present in our American symbology. Also, the eagle that sees far, that protected the Great Law of Peace. We all know that the American eagle is America's national bird. So the eagle is very present and very prevalent in American symbology as well. And then the bundle of arrows that was said to be buried beneath the Tree of Peace to represent the 5 tribes coming together. Well, in American symbology, again, the back of the dollar and on the presidential seal, you can see that this bundle of arrows is present, but an important change is that it was changed to 13 arrows, representing the 13 colonies. So some changes were made, but these symbols were definitely borrowed and integrated into American symbology. And then finally, you will read in the Larkin piece that there was also a separation of leaders for peacetime and leaders for wartime. And that separation of civil and military aspects of government has also been borrowed and integrated into our United States form of government. So understand those key symbols that were adopted from the Great Law of Peace. So moving on, thinking about the overall relationship between the indigenous peoples and early Americans. So most of us are probably somewhat familiar with this relationship, and we know that if we know nothing else, we know there's a history of conflicts. There have been several conflicts since the establishment of the very first colony. So some of the causes for those conflicts. One cause, and this is where you would be filling in this information: competition for resources, also population pressure, as more settlers came in and they were kind of confined to the smaller cities and towns on the East Coast at first. And of course, that desire to spread out was a push because the population was growing and the cities were kind of bursting at the seams. So as the people decided to push westward, that pushed the indigenous people or the Native Americans westward as well, pushed them out of their ancestral lands. So that was a source of conflict. Another source is the ideology of manifest destiny. So many of you may have heard of it before, and that is the idea that God wants the new Americans to have all of the land. So if God wants it, then any actions that are taken must be right. This idea of manifest destiny is another important cause for the conflicts that were constantly happening between the indigenous people and the American colonists. So, moving on to another important aspect of the relationship between indigenous people and early Americans, the Indian Removal Act is key for you to understand how this relationship evolved and was basically damaged almost irreparably. So the Indian Removal Act passed in 1830 by Andrew Jackson. And what he did was he authorized the negotiation with 5 tribes of Native Americans, different tribes from those that came together under the Great Law of Peace. 5 tribes, and those tribes they included the Chickasaw, Choctaw, Muskogee Creek, the Seminole tribe, and the original Cherokee nations. And he authorized negotiations with them, saying that if they agreed to move west of the Mississippi River, then they would not be forced to move anymore. That was the offer that was made to them. Move west, leave your ancestral homelands, and then we will not have any more conflicts. However, 3/4 of I can't remember the number, a majority of the leadership of the tribes had to agree in order for the deal to be accepted, and they did not agree. So rather than kind of accepting their refusal, the Indian Removal Act was authorized, and what that did was forcibly remove the members of these tribes from their homelands. So they, and that is also where the Trail of Tears happened, which is important for you to remember. The Indian Removal Act was the cause for the Trail of Tears, which was a walk that the members of the 5 tribes had to make all the way from their ancestral homelands to a relocation center. And on the way, thousands of people died in the cold and were just they had to leave them on the side of the road because the military literally walked these individuals from their homelands to the relocation centers. So they were not allowed to take their belongings. They weren't allowed to get themselves ready or take clothing that would be suitable for the trip. And those who were older or young or sick, they died along the way, and there was nothing that the tribes could do about it. So that's why it's called the Trail of Tears. Lots of sorrow and lots of pain kind of embedded in this act of removing the Indians from their homelands. So last piece to understand is that treaties were often made and broken between the government, the United States government, and the indigenous peoples. In the case of trying to address conflicts, trying to gather more resources, the colonists wanting more resources. Treaties are agreements between 2 sovereign nations. And so what treaties require is ratification. Treaties do not go into effect until Congress ratifies them or approves them. So when you watch the Minnie Waconee documentary, keep that in mind. Keep in mind what it means to be a sovereign nation. And although our Native American brothers and sisters are considered to be members of sovereign nations, keep that in mind when you watch the documentary and consider whether they're actually treated as sovereign. And then also identify any connection with the historical themes that we talked about as far as the causes for conflict, historical themes, and what we're seeing now. So any continuation or what we were seeing regarding the Dakota Access Pipeline. So that concludes the second part for the Module 2 video lecture. You already have the Module 3 lecture for America's federal system. So hopefully this is of help for you, and please email me if you have any remaining questions.